Hi and welcome, and thanks for joining us today for our next chat on race and disability. Today's topic is going to be behaviors and classifications for Black students with IEPs. So if you're not familiar with the 13 categories of disability that are listed in IDEA, we'll review those, but hopefully you're familiar with them. Last week, the group talked about system racism and diagnostics, experiences of Black parents during evals and by medical professionals. If you didn't get a chance to see that, it is still on the Facebook page under videos. So take a look. And next week, we're going to build off of behaviors, what they're talking about today. And next week is going to be much more about discipline, suspension, arrests, and SROs, things like that. So if the group doesn't get too much into that today, even though we're talking about behaviors, that's why, because we have devoted, pretty much an entire episode, if you want to call them episodes, on, kind of the school to prison pipeline. So the group is going to introduce themselves as they participate in the chat. We forgot to do intros last week, and that's my fault. So I hope that you listen and learn this time. And I'm going to turn it over to Sophia.
Good afternoon, everybody. Of course, thank you again for joining us. Today's topic, as Lisa so eloquently put it, focuses on classifications, discipline, and how that intersects with race within special education. I am, again, Sophia Jenkins, and I am a father of 5. My son, who is 6, has autism. One of the experiences that really causes me to be passionate about this topic is the fact that at a young 4 years old, my son was attending a program where the educators attempted to give him or they tried to update his records and mark him as not only being defiant, but having over-aggressive behavior, which they wanted to document in his record. Obviously, at the time, we learned that they were not following his IEP. They also were not giving him the supports that he needed as a result. And consequently, they attempted to make it about behavior, which, as we've noted in prior broadcasts, is an occurrence that happens all too frequently for students of color. And so in the end, it was determined that he, in fact, was not overly aggressive, but instead was simply stimming as a result of his autism and was not being supported, nor was the response appropriate for his diagnosis. The attempt, of course, carried forward in following years where everything was remanded to behavior again. They tried and issued a behavior modification plan, which after disputing it was not something that the child study team agreed to pursue. So that's just a bit about the experience. It turned out in the end also that he was being bullied and was in fact being essentially blamed for being a victim. And so these are the types of things that we note as parents. And I think it's important that we continue to highlight these so that the general population at large can understand that these experiences are not unique to individual families, but are systemically and disproportionately adversely impacting families of color. At this moment, we're going to turn it over to Maria, who will continue forward with the conversation as we delve deeper into this topic.
Thank you, Sophia. So I am Maria Davis Pierre. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Florida, and I am the CEO and founder of Autism in Black, Inc., which aims to support Black parents who have a child diagnosed with autism, as well as train organizations to be culturally responsive when it comes to the Black disability community. And as Sophia was saying and Lisa was saying today, we're talking about classifications and behaviors. And I think the overall message that we want to convey here is that when it comes to Black students, we are often misdiagnosed and placed in the wrong categories, right? And when we think about that, we have to go back to sessions that we've had in the past and talk about one, evaluator bias. So if a evaluator has not, excuse me, my son is running over here, parenting in real life. If we're thinking about evaluator bias and seeing that the evaluator, meaning school psychologists, the teachers, anybody that's on the IEP team, if they have not done the work, if they are not aware of their own biases, implicit and explicit, if they are looking at Black children and their biases are coming out before even thinking about the evaluations, then that affects the actual evaluations and the outcomes of those evaluations, which leads our children to be placed in the wrong categories. You know, it's 2020 and the CDC just announced this year, you know, autism has the same prevalence across all races. And that was needed prior to 2020. But we're saying that because of the biases that come with healthcare professionals. We need them to know that Black kids can be autistic, right? So that they can give the right diagnosis. So we're constantly being placed in that OHI category for, you know, ADHD, or that lovely EBD category that's a category that the school has, but is not an actual diagnosis in the DSM. So, you know, when looking at that, if we're placed in the wrong categories, we're not going to get the right services that we need. People are going to automatically assume things, especially when they see that EBD category. So it is a disservice to our Black children. And we're wanting you to understand that this is happening very frequently because of the school not having training on being culturally responsive. So back again to the evaluators, if they're not doing the work and getting, you know, making sure that these evaluations that they're using are not so whitewashed, which they are because of, you know, mental health, the whole mental health system is pretty much whitewashed. So that affects us. So these are the things that we want you guys to know and understand. So I am going to let Sharon talk a little bit about her experiences.
Yes, hi. Good afternoon. Thank you, Maria. My name is Sharon Scipio. As I mentioned before, we have 4 children, but the one that we talked about previously, or even the children per se, as speaking with misdiagnosis or not even having a diagnosis. Our son who's on the spectrum, we didn't get his diagnosis until into his 15th birthday. So by then we've missed opportunities for early intervention. We've missed opportunities for supports that he could be getting, which was not there. And not that he was not capable, he's very capable. He has a wonderful memory. He has a photographic memory where he can remember things. It just takes him twice, not 5, 6, 7, 8 times. It just takes times. And these are coping mechanisms that he has had to develop himself to be able to be successful. But what that has done, as Maria has said, when these inappropriate classifications are placed upon our children, certain individuals will look at that, and the treatment or the services our children get, or lack of services they get, goes hand in hand. Even with autism, being autism and a young Black boy, they don't think that he's capable, or they think he has a behavioral issue. So if he has a behavioral issue, well, we're not going to put him anywhere. Oh, wait, he also doesn't want to go to college. So we're just going to stick him in a class where he's learning skills that he sits there and he is bored beyond his wits. Again, if you as the evaluator are not culturally competent, if you're not even competent of the on the diagnosis per se and what these categories and diagnosis do to our children, it's detrimental to them, because it's not just in the educational system, it's what they're able to do later on in life. And I will say it again, if they're not exposed to the higher level math, if they're not exposed to the science classes, you are predetermining for our children what they are able to do later on in life. So it sets up a pattern, and then it's not a pattern for our children to easily overcome, because when they go out and they're dealing with white society, they're dealing with these preconceived notions of what they can and cannot do. And having these labels are extremely detrimental. Thank you, Maria. I'll put it back on to you.
Thank you. Yes, that is extremely important, as Sharon was sharing. I'm going to turn it over to Sabra to share her experiences.
Hi, I'm Sabra Townsend. I am the mother of a 22-year-old young man who has been from kindergarten through graduating from high school in public education in Philadelphia. So the issue with my son and behaviors is that he is actually a very mild-mannered kid, meaning that he doesn't really talk a lot. When he does have something to say, it's very short and to the point. And I mentioned that because often I noticed that if he was quiet and not bothering or being a problem, everything was thought to be fine. So it's not a question of whether or not he was described as having any sort of emotional issues, but it was because he did not exhibit any oppositional behaviors that he was thought to be an easy kid and often overlooked for the services that he required to access his public education. And so I had to often battle the system, the public education system, to fully evaluate him. In fact, we went and got additional independent educational evaluations and independent functional behavior assessments. Not because I was trying to give him a behavior problem, because I was trying to make sure that the issues that he had were recognized, because he and still is a pretty easy to manage child until he isn't. Because there were behavioral outbursts. I used to call them Brandon storms. And I would call it almost ESP. I would call it spidey senses. When I could sense something wasn't right, that he was trying to communicate and couldn't communicate, and all hell would break loose. But these happened so infrequently, and once you got the sense of what was going on, you could figure out what caused it. But on any given moment, he usually was relatively mild. And so that was the challenge. The older he got, the further apart these Brandon storms became. So on the one hand, he's relatively mild-mannered. On the other hand, I'm seeing things like elopement and flight risk, and things, to Sharon's earlier point, that would follow him all the way through, as opposed to figuring out what the antecedent was to figure out why the behavior happened, so that they could figure what the follow-on would be. So I mentioned that because there are so many different ways you can look at how people underestimate and don't presume competence for children, and particularly Black children, when it's time to do the evaluations and provide the interventions that are necessary. So it was a challenge for me, and still is a challenge for me in a different, from a different perspective. And then the other piece that has always and still is often a challenge is because one of his physical diagnoses affects his activities of daily living. And in the school setting, that means going to the bathroom. And what behaviors not only he had to say that he had to go, but what other students would do or not do if he didn't do what a typical boys line up to go to the restroom, girls line up to go to the restroom. Well, he had a totally different thing that he needed to do. And that then started to create different issues around not only how long it took to use the restroom, but also who all may or may not have needed to be in the restroom to help him with his activities of daily living. So it's often a challenge. That's a specific issue, but it's often a challenge because it was thought because he was so quiet, people would overlook him. And then when an episode would happen, it was, oh my goodness, what happened? What this kid's gonna run away? He's gonna, he either hurt himself or others. It was always a challenge to have them be clear about what services needed to be provided. So that's it for me for now.
Thank you, Sabra. And just to reiterate why we are having this discussion is because it's important to note how, one, just our race alone impacts everything, right? So as parents who have children who have IEPs, who have disabilities, we all on some level experience hardships within the school system. But when we factor in being Black, that adds on a lot of hardships, because if my child is with an evaluator who is not culturally responsive, who has implicit and explicit biases that they haven't addressed, then that evaluator is basing a lot of what they're seeing on their own biases, right? So if remember, I discussed that study that was done by the APA 2 weeks ago, the American Psychological Association. Okay, sorry, my kids again. Okay, go play. A lot of features here today. But the American Psychological Association did a study on teachers who were looking at the emotions of students just based on their facial expressions and nothing else. So if a teacher is looking and seeing a child and looking at the Black children and they're seeing all anger, think about how that also impacts an evaluator who's coming in with those same biases, and they're looking at my child and evaluating them to put them in a category to get services. And if they're seeing anger and everything else, misdiagnosis is going to happen. And if for Black parents, again, remember, we don't have the resources and the information getting to our communities like that. So then we're in a place where we don't know exactly what to do because we're trusting the school to do what they need to do for our children, right? And then thinking about it, if they're given the wrong diagnosis and the schools give us trouble, then what do they say? Oh, you can always get an independent evaluation. Yes, we do know that, but we also know that a lot of schools make us cover it first before they then will do the refund. And then thinking about the Black community, we are more prone to be born into poverty and stay there. People do not have $2,000 and $3,000 to then go and get their child evaluated independently, then come back to the school, give it to them, and then they still may not agree with that independent evaluation. Then factor in things like job flexibility, right? Having insurance or no insurance. These are all factors that affect us more as a community. So these are things you guys really should be thinking about when talking about how the intersection of race and disability affects us by and large. So I'm going to turn it over to Thea next, who has some stuff to say.
Okay, thank you, Maria, and hello, everyone. My name is Thea. I live outside of Philadelphia, about northwest of Philly, about 45 minutes. I have 3 sons. I'm a chemist, a realtor, a nurse, a number of different careers that I've had. But I think probably the most difficult one has been navigating special education. I mean, Maria talked about it. She said, well, we have a lot of different things we have to deal with. We're dealing with a disability, so that's one weight on. We're dealing with our brown skin. There's another thing. We might be dealing with a number of different disabilities, so then you just kind of like add those up. And when it comes down to it, we all know, I mean, if you've had to navigate special education, we already know how difficult it is. And then on top of it, having, you know, to deal with some of the biases that we face daily. One of the things that I'm reminded of, just so many different things in hearing the conversations and the stories from some of the other panelists. I think of my son, one of my sons has autism. And I remember in middle school, he came, no, not middle school, actually elementary school. I mean, I could have stories for every single, you know, grade, but every paper he brought home was 100. He was doing great in school, all A's. We were starting testing at that point because some things were identified in second grade. So then we had a 504, we started out with that. But when we got our report card, do you think they were all A's on the report card, even though the grades came? They weren't. The grades were probably closer to C's. And I had to question that because I thought, wait. Are we looking at his academic achievement, or are we giving him his grade based on his behavior? And that's really what it came down to. I mean, I called the school on it. I said something to the principal. That year, I didn't even show him his report card because I felt that it didn't reflect his ability. And it's very sad. You know, I guess I you know, when I remember that, I am kind of triggered because how often does that happen? I mean, I think we all know that it happens a lot. If we're looking, we need to be able to separate. And I don't even remember at that time that they did an FBA, you know, an FBA, functional behavior analysis. Probably not until middle school they did that. And that's because things were getting worse. I remember walking into IEP meetings, and each time there were more and more people there. The principal was there. The supervisor of special education was there. I mean, each time I'd go in, there'd be like, I mean, it started out with maybe 2 people, and then there'd be 6 and 7 and 8. And I was like, oh my gosh, they're getting ready to expel him. Like, rather than go through and, you know, let's say do a proper evaluation and give him the services that he needed, I felt like they were about to give him the boot. And I remember they used to call me every single week, just about a couple times a week sometimes, with different things that happened. And I have to say that one time I just had enough. And I said, you know what? You're calling me every week about a problem that are behaviors that we know are part of my son's disability. And I don't understand why you keep calling me because we know that he has this disability. And it sounds to me like you're discriminating against him. And I just outright said that to them. And you know what? They stopped calling me. And, you know, I can think of another time where there were behavior issues. He was on the bus and he had taken a sewing project to school. And then he was on the bus and he kept pretending like he was going to put the needle in his eye. No, that's not good, right? I mean, you know, we all agree he should not be putting a needle to his eye like that. One other kid saw it, grabbed the needle out of his hand and threw the needle out the window of the bus. And so what do you think my son did when that happened? He punched the kid in the nose. So that was a whole big mess that I had to deal with the school. And I 100% agree, my son shouldn't have punched the kid in the nose. He was triggered, yes. But my question to the school was, well, what are we going to do about the other kid? You know, he kind of, I mean, I don't know. I guess I see it as my son was triggered and he shouldn't have done it, but the other kid shouldn't have grabbed, you know. So anyway, long story short is, I really think that when we're looking at situations with our kids where maybe they're not being characterized properly, and like I said last week, if we can't, you know, figure out exactly what it is that's going on, we can't work with them to fix it. And it's so important when we're dealing with a situation where someone is, let's say our kid is struggling, right? And they're having a hard time and something's going wrong. Do we really think the answer is to punish that kid or figure out what it is we need to do to help them? I mean, I think we all want to help, right? Somebody, I don't know, if someone cut their hand, we wouldn't punish them for actually cutting their hand. We would say, oh my goodness, let me look. Maybe you need stitches. Let me help you fix it. So, you know, that analogy, when I talk about physical harm or something like that, take it over to us dealing with our IEPs and our, disabilities. I think we always should be trying to help rather than punish. I'll pass it back over to you, Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Thea.
Say something.
In thinking of all of this, we know that the school has 13 categories that they place our children in, and thinking about the evaluations that actually lead to these our children being placed in these categories, and thinking about implicit and explicit biases by the evaluators. Let's talk some about that famous EBD category that is so like to be used with our children. And I'm going to turn it over to Sophia to talk about this category, as he has some stats to share and some information on this particular category and why we want to focus a little bit on this actual category.
Thank you, Maria. So to help frame this conversation, it's important that we understand a few things. And before I jump into those, I just want to tell everyone who's listening that some of these statistics are reminders of what we've covered, but they are foundational for this topic and for this discussion. So I'm going to share first. As shown here, in 2015, the National Council on Disability reported that 85% of youth behind bars have a disability. Now, when you overlay that with the fact that those youths that are imprisoned are overrepresented by Black children and other minority groups, this further exasperates the issue. And so while we're discussing that and while we're on the topic, I also want to point out this interesting fact. While we're talking about emotional disability, it's important that we understand what it even means. Under the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, it is defined as a condition exhibiting one or more of these characteristics on your screen for any long period of time to a marked degree, adversely affecting their educational performance. Now, it's not necessarily the definition itself that poses the problem, but it's the vagueness thereof, because at any point in a child's educational career or their educational journey, if any of these characteristics are demonstrated by that student, they can receive an emotional disturbance or an EBD classification. When you look at what these characteristics entail, you have an inability to learn that can't be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. Meanwhile, we have students who have sensory challenges that are still receiving this classification. So how do we get to the point where we can segment the behavior or their inability to learn from the sensory challenges that they face because of their real diagnosis, in some cases being autism? The second characteristic, as shown here, is an inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers. Well, that obviously is something that would constitute learned behavior. And if, in fact, a student is unable to build or maintain a satisfactory interpersonal relationship with a peer in the classroom, that could be explained by bullying. It could be explained by a number of other external factors that are not identified here. And because of the lack of guidance, and of course, again, the vagueness of this definition, it's no wonder that we have administrators and CSTs looking to classify Black students with this type of classification. C is an inappropriate type of behavior or feeling under normal circumstances. How do we determine the appropriateness of the behavior if not given the guidance? D, a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression. This is one of the most glaring issues that is presented with this definition. When you have facts like Black students being overwhelmingly relegated to cities, larger cities, and having little access to economic advancement in the country, you would also have, as a result of that fact, moods of unhappiness, moods of depression. It's a widely known fact that in larger cities where there is lower economic access or achievement by those cities and by those residents, that you will have a larger influence of gang activity and or violence that would traumatize children to and from school, which they carry with them into the classroom. And therefore you would end up having an overwhelming classification of EBD for such students if in fact those factors are not taken into account. Lastly, it says a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school programs. They say EBD includes schizophrenia, but it does not include children who are socially maladjusted unless they're determined to still have an emotional disturbance. So it's no wonder that we have such disparities in communities where Black children are present. We already have an underrepresentation of Black male teachers in the classroom across the country. And therefore, as you've already stated, panelists, Maria and others, the lack of culturally responsive education or practices within the school building. And so if you don't understand my culture, if you don't understand my experience, then you're not going to be able to empathize with behaviors to try and understand what I'm trying to say without verbalizing it. So as a student, I'm going to be relegated to a classification that doesn't truly fit my experience or my needs, and certainly does not get responded to with additional supports that would help me to access my education. One additional slide I want to cover is that when we're looking at the classification process of Black students in America, it's important to remember that in 2016 and 2017 school year, 35% of students who dropped out of school had emotional disturbance classifications. 35%. So when we talk about how a lot of this is framed, this conversation, from our experiences, from our personal encounters with the practices leveraged within the school building, these numbers also paint a very bleak picture because they indicate a direct link between dropping out and failure to succeed or to complete schooling for students who receive emotional disturbance classifications. Because in many cases, such as is shown here, it's a sentence for the death of their educational career. We also show here that Black students are twice as likely as their white peers to be classified as having an emotional behavioral disturbance. Twice as likely. I'll let that resonate with you. And I don't think it requires much supportive context or theory on my part. And lastly, we show Black students are 3 times as likely as their white peers to be classified as having an intellectual disturbance or disability. What this also tells us is that it's unlikely, or there's certainly an underrepresentation of the use of other health impaired, where we find that is widely used as a norm in school districts that are not majority Black. And so it begs the question, these classifications, one being framed by the fact that it's associated with behaviors, it's associated with personal interpretation by an administrator or a school educator. But it also is coupled with the fact that the response means that students are getting limited supports to overcome the challenges that led to the classification in the first place. And so when we talk about things like the school to prison pipeline and how it's fed by failed policies and failed practices, and really by students being earmarked for these tracks or trajectories as young as second and third grade. It really is no wonder how in New Jersey, of all of the youth that are in prison, you have less than 15 white students across the state, white youths across the state. And so it's really mind-blowing that these disparities exist, but it's also perpetuated by the fact that there is no true guidance given at the Fed level. And oftentimes, of course, at the state level, where the Department of Education has given a definition that is so vague that they literally rob our students and our children of the opportunity to succeed. Maria, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sophia, for that and providing those stats. And this is why we say it's so important for school staff to get culturally responsive training, because especially for our evaluators, because as a therapist, in school we aren't taught the DSM, we are taught the interventions, but we're not taught how it applies to cultures. So if I'm only looking at the DSM, which again is whitewashed as it was created by white men based on white men, and if I'm looking at all of this and applying it to for instance, Black female, those, those characteristics of what I'm seeing in the DSM may not apply. So again, we're seeing all this, we're saying, oh, it doesn't fit here, it doesn't fit here. It doesn't fit because you're not culturally responsive or looking at it through cultural humility in regards to the diagnosis. So then we're placing you in this category because we're so unsure of what it is that our evaluations are now biased in this, scores are now skewed. So now you're placed into this category and you're getting the wrong interventions and services, right? So this is why it's so important for us to say, and call out the schools and make sure that they're doing this, make sure they're decolonizing their curriculum, making sure that their staff is appropriately trained and responding to students in a cultural responsive way. So I'm gonna let Monique talk next. I know she has something to say.
Maybe just some things rolling around in my head. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monique Douche, and my son Kyrie is 34 years old with autism and a host of other things. So today we're talking about behaviors and classifications for Black students with IEPs. And where does this begin? Just from all of the conversations, obviously, the behaviors are seen from the beginning, just because they are Black boys or Black girls. The classifications or lack of are given at the beginning. As I've mentioned before, my son, I think I have the oldest child on this panel, so things have definitely changed somewhat in regards to the access to an autism classification. However, it still remains the same in looking at our children as behavioral problems, emotionally disturbed, bad kids. It starts to create that pipeline to institutions. Yes, we still have them. To group homes, to prison. Because we have to look at the entire spectrum. And those of us or those who have family members on that entire spectrum, where a lot of things were built on behaviors and those challenges instead of why. What is this person representing in the way that they are communicating? Which is another way or another access or another way to deny someone their civil rights by not hearing the manner in which they communicate. And that it may not necessarily, or it is not a behavior, but rather a lack of power. and think about this, a lack of power. So if I have no power, if everyone is always prompting, doing everything for me, and the only way that I can speak out loud and speak loudly is to do something that gets your attention, what am I telling you? And so we have to stop looking at behavioral challenges as just that and start looking at what is this person communicating to me and what does this represent? And that can start to change the conversation on the side of the educator or the psychologist or that child study team, but more importantly, for those of us that are parents, and to feel that you can open your mouth and say, we need to find why. We don't need to do this strategy. We don't need to medicate. Another thing that is disproportionately done in Black and Brown communities around behaviors. But to ask those questions why, and to find those answers out, and to really stop creating these avenues to prison and to other type of institutions where you might find yourself ending up, even along the within the psychiatric hospitals and those things as well, which we will have those conversations as we continue to move forward through these conversations. Maria?
Thank you for sharing, Monique. I'm going to turn it over to Jess, who has something to say.
Hi there. My name is Jessica. I am the parent of 2 young boys that are both receiving supports. My youngest is still 4, so he's through early intervention. And my eldest is 10, so he's going through the school district. I have been supporting my eldest since he was very, very young, and he received his diagnosis at about 20 months. And I wanted to kind of qualify in some ways his history, because I think that for many of the viewers who are able to sort of in their own personal experience watch how children are treated or supported through the school or their IEP development process, many of the things I'm going to say are things that you've experienced or helped other parents with, but maybe you don't necessarily see the different elements kind of coming together and how difficult addressing children, especially children of color, with such an emphasis on behaviors and with such a generalization like emotional disturbance comes to such a deficit or creates such a deficit for them specifically. My son at 20 months old was struggling in daycare and demonstrated biting and hitting of other children. And I just so happened to be at that private school teaching at another class. So I was privy at that time to the behaviors my son was exhibiting and made aware that he needed to receive some support. And I took that information and I went as far as I possibly could. We had 2 neurodevelopmental opportunities and had him evaluated in speech. And when we were, and this is, by the way, living in New Jersey, we were able to receive a lot of support from our local county and from our local school district for him. And we felt things were going well. But anytime I had mentioned that things like the way my son would interact with other children or speak weren't necessarily a matter of his deficit, which we were aware at the time was autism, but it had more to do with our home life. Coming from a Latinx background, our family members do not have a real strong alignment with concepts like rugged individualism or sharing being a solitary ownership. The kids in our families were often told and expected to share and to give everything they had. And so when my son entered a lot of the environments that we were in at 20 months old, he had an expectation of general giving and sharing that the school culture actually didn't necessarily invest in. So we started kind of realizing that our culture wasn't really being attended to. We had to remold our child to fit into this culture, this environment. And that's hard. That's especially hard for children who are autistic. So when we have these Venn diagrams of behavior and Venn diagrams of actual deficits, you can't tell which one is which, but you certainly as an adult should be able to advocate for those things. And those were things that we weren't receiving. We weren't receiving real support for what was culturally sensitive to us, which is how our sense of generosity really stemmed from, our expectations came from when they were very young. When a sibling of another family member came over, we never, were overtly hard with the younger kids. We always expected them to share. And he would go into environments where adults were telling him, that's not yours, you cannot touch. And it wasn't a matter of my child not knowing how to share. It was a matter of simply it really being instituted. Children had spaces, children had more rigid expectations. And quite frankly, it was a cultural thing, and it was very, very strong that in the, I would say, more Americanized cultures, we were expected to behave in a different way, and my son wasn't used to it. And so because he was autistic and very rigid, we started seeing a lot of kickback. So emotion became the number one factor. How do we handle his emotion? How do we deal with outbursts? As opposed to saying he communicates differently and the way they handle things at home are different. How can we meet in the middle? How can we explain things to him at 20 months old, at 4 years old, at 7 years old, in a way that was more sensitive to what he knows? Because it's not what he knows is bad, it's just different. Now we're in this position where at 10 years old, or actually at 9 years old, the school district is trying to redefine my son from other health impairments to emotional disturbance. And my son does have autism, which he has a diagnosis from a neurodevelopmental who he had seen since he was 20 months old. The doctor time and time again wrote recommendations, requests for speech pathologists in school, for OT in school, for extra support in school with writing, with a request for specifically for allowing him to use a tablet to type because writing was very difficult for him and he was demonstrating behaviors. All of those were dismissed. My son also received outside OT therapy. So we took him from the IU and we paid for an OT. We also did speech pathology. All of those doctors submitted their letters to the school about him having things like expressive receptive language disorders. All of those were dismissed by the school. I asked him why he wasn't diagnosed as under the school's category of autism. He had autism. Their response was that autism is not really handled the way you think it is. It's usually for children who just don't speak and we put them in a special area. I said, isn't that your choice how you handle it? But the classification is appropriate. It's not about how, again, they classified you or categorized you. It is a part of how they're classifying you. Because the way they're classifying you is based off of implicit bias, and that's the greatest or most difficult part here. That my child who was in need of more support, I had to fight for to get a second round of FBAs when he was 3 years over the timeline. And they simply wanted to focus on how his behaviors were inappropriate and they can give him reprimands and how they can increase punishers without necessarily getting down to why in general he was struggling. He had, for example, I think one of the things that was in the emotional disturbance was that you had to have difficulty exclusive of sensory difficulty or health issues. And like Sophia had said, my son demonstrated all of that and they still tried to recategorize him as emotionally disturbed, which made no sense to me. I had explained that he was struggling and he was acting out, but I don't believe that the punishers were doing anything but creating more anxiety. And their response was that it is real life, that when he does something negative, that he has negative consequences. And I'm literally going to quote as best as possible what they said to me. And this was not just a teacher. This was at a table of 13 other people with the head of special education of the district, who said, our concern is that children will grow up and do these sorts of behaviors outside and they'll go to prison. Don't you want to teach them now before they get there that these can be consequences? And I explained, my child should be able to make mistakes and learn in school, not outside. And this should not be the precipice of how you're going to address him. It's addressing him as if you're already looking at a child who's going to go to prison. At that point, I knew I had to pull him out of the school district, which is what I did. But it's about how complicated and ingrained that mental perception of where these children are going anyway, of consequences, of keeping children in their place, specifically children of color, because they've already presumed them as being more naturally inclined for this. And I say that because there's really no other way to look at a family who spent years receiving all the supports and eventually a neuropsych evaluation that supported that his behaviors were only stemming from their reactions as opposed to their proactive attempts to address many things that we knew he had, like dysgraphia, potentially dyslexia, which they refused to support. And he had received OT and all these other things in early intervention they refused to implement in the school. So we had to really evaluate, was it a safe place to keep him in? And it wasn't. And we were lucky because I can homeschool him. But not everybody's able to do that. So once your child gets worse and worse off and your classifications are behavioral and they're not actually addressing directly through scientifically proven methodologies how to retrain or support these children, and you're only working on are we rewarding or are we punishing them for behaviors, we get stuck. Our families like mine, we're stuck, and my son's traumatized. I don't think I could put him back into a school district again under those conditions. And I think that I am too. And so I have to say that having seen many children go through this sort of situation and having been in it personally, it's about what was said by a very wise Ms. Sharon earlier. It's culture, and we want to fix that. We want to address that. We're trying to mark that we've done what we can, but it's culture. If you're going to walk presuming children are more likely to end up in prison, or they need to learn these are the consequences because somehow you as a parent haven't demonstrated that to them, we're going to be stuck. So just wanted to give you guys my piece.
Thank you for that, Jess. I'm going to turn it over to Sharon next, who has something to say.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Jess. Couple of points I wanted to address, and I wanted to go back first to what Jess was saying, and this speaks to the fact that our children are forced into being adults first before they're even being allowed to be children. I believe Maria said, like, her child whose behavior, it's like saying Petey's behavior, oh, that's cute, but Daquan or Hakeem or whatever name you'd like to stereotypically give our children, their behavior is bad behavior. Their behavior is behavior that is just not acceptable. But Tommy and Petey and Sarah and Jane and Betsy are in the corner doing the exact same thing that my child is doing, but my child is being seen as, well, there they go on their way to prison. Again, cultural biases. Something else I want to address, and this is a big deal for us because it goes across the board. When we're looking at, and this is addressing Monique alluded to this, and so did Sophia. When you're looking at even programs that our children have that they can do after school, they're missing from our community. Or even if we move into an affluent community, like I am in Princeton, we can't afford half of the things that my white neighbor can afford for their children. So even though we're here in this community, we are now priced out of being able to give our children the resources and stuff to allow them to be successful. One of the things that I'm reading here says majority African American Latina after school programs face the most severe demand and financial strain. Close to 7 in 10 African American majority programs, which is 68%, and 65% for the Latino. Here we go again, Blacks. This is why we're having this discussion, because Black Lives Matter. Black children, right? The majority of programs report the funding is being just taken away. It's becoming non-existent. So, and I'm going out here on this, but when people are saying, let's not put all this money into our police because you now have police who are buying these. I've seen some of their vehicles. I don't know what you want to call it, but you're thinking, why do I need this tactical vehicle in my community? So now you're policing me in this tactical way, and you're gearing my children for what? Prison. When all my children need is the ability to have access to after school programs, to have access in school, if we're going to even go further back, which is why we're here, to discuss about the misdiagnosis, although you all don't diagnose in school, but then you classify, and then you inappropriately classify our children and put them in inappropriate situations that sets them up. It doesn't start to say that they're out of school and they have all this access to resources. We don't in our community. And again, not because we don't know, not because we haven't researched, not because we haven't looked into it. And yes, we've read our prize book, and yes, we've gone to the different associations to get help. But if we don't have the resources, or even if we don't have to know without, and wait, I'm probably working 5 jobs because you've blocked me out of working that appropriate job that I'm more than well qualified to do, but you're saving it for Betsy and Sarah and Jane. You're definitely not giving me that job and the ability to financially support my children where I need to support them. And that goes to even getting the proper diagnosis. So while I'm getting the proper diagnosis, time is elapsing and my child is getting older and older and older. So then this ability to get this resource, my child is now 21. What are we doing with that? Am I keeping, my child is now age out of the system. So in your lack of efforts, in your inability, in your refusal to see that my child is worthy.
Right.
It's your culture, and it's the culture in which, I'm sorry, Monique. It's the culture that you all have established. And that's nothing that has started now. It is something that you've done historically. You've enslaved us. Well, we're not going to enslave you anymore. And the Reconstruction era, I'm just going on a little historical thing here. Then we're talking sharecroppers, but wait, we're not going to pay you enough to make a living. Oh yeah, and we're not going to give you that land. We're going to start the land, but we're not going to give you the land. Oh, let's talk about the Freedom Bureau that was set up to treat us medically, and doctors that don't want to treat us and touch our Black bodies because they're fear of being touched with our, I'm sorry, superior beings, because you've taken our knowledge and completely decimated our history that we can't even teach our children, to let our children know that you come from royalty, that you are kings and queens, and the system that you're dealing with is one that has been set up from the birth of this nation to hold you back. So what can you do to help us? You cannot be culturally incompetent. You can take your personal biases, your explicit or implicit biases, put them aside and think, when you look at my child, but that my child is just as deserving as your white child.
Right. Sharon, I wanted to kind of piggyback on something, it was interesting. You said some of the things that, for those of you that are listening, for those of you that are receiving perhaps some information to links that you might need in your life right now. And I hope that and we appreciate the fact that this platform has provided that for you. But I hope that most of you out here realize that we don't expect things to change overnight. This is 400 plus years of these type of practices. However, the goal was to listen. And in doing that, I just get a little disturbed that there is so much going on in the chat that seems to be more about being that white savior again. I think that some of you are missing the point. This is about listening to experiences, taking some of what we are saying and really self-reflecting, looking within yourselves, looking at how you might be able to change some of your practices. A lot of you are a part of this page each and every day, and you can throw out your PTI, and you can get your resources here several times a day. Perhaps take this time to listen. That's all that I'd like to say. Maria?
Thank you, Monique.
You're welcome.
Yes, and thank you, Sharon, for sharing as well. The study that Sharon was talking about that I referenced to was that little Black boys are no longer cute after 2. They are then seen as aggressive, a disturbance, and things like that in the school system. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, one, the adultification of Black students within the schools. So if we're looking at how my kid is 4 years old and held to a standard of somebody in 5th or 6th grade, they're never going to meet that bar. They're never going to meet that standard that that teacher is holding to them. So they're constantly going to be looked at as failing in the teacher's eyes because they're seeing them as a child that is way older than what their actual age is, right? So that's what we have, what we're telling you to think about when you're looking at our students, when you're looking at our children, when you're dealing with our children. Check yourself and the biases that you have, because if you're looking at my 4-year-old and you're saying, oh my goodness, he really should be able to sit for an hour. 4-year-olds are not sitting for an hour, okay? They're barely sitting for 15 minutes, okay? You've seen my children come up here several times to interrupt me, okay? So yes, we have to be realistic about how we view children, especially Black children, because the adultification of our children is real. When looking at Black boys, aggressive, disturbance. We're looking at Black girls, they're seen as being women who don't need nurturing, who don't need to be cared about, whose emotions don't matter, who know everything about sex but don't know anything about education. These are the stigmas that you're placing on our children because of your own implicit and explicit biases of how you view us. So this is a time to check yourself and check how you view us as Black people. And I know that Sophia has something to say as well.
Thank you, Maria. And it goes right along with what you've just said. Not only are our children statistically underserved in communities that are predominantly Black or have any notable percentage of Black students, but there's what you just described as the adultification of Black children. When you talk about adultification, you know, it's not a foreign concept for us because we see it every day. We see how when our children enter an education facility or into an aftercare program, how non-white educators or administrators begin to ask questions about their age and suggesting that they look older than they truly are, or the news reports that suggest that the Black man that was taken down by the police was brawly and big and was a monster. And so they had to contain him. And so the only way they could contain a human being is to kill him because he's just too big for them to handle. These are the types of things that justify the misbehaviors on the part of adults who are tasked with educating children. My son was in an aftercare program in Newark, New Jersey, a predominantly Black and brown community. And again, we're talking about systemic oppression, systems that are in place where they are informed by biases, and yet structurally they continue to perpetuate the disparities that exist. And so while the educators were all predominantly Black within this facility, the reaction was still very much the same because of what they were taught to expect as a norm and how their response to certain protocols or behaviors were expected to be rendered. My son, in his backpack with his lunchbox, carried children's utensils, fork, knife, spoon. Of course, it's designed for a young child. He was 4 at the time. They're rounded, they're very dull. They do not pose a threat to anyone. However, we received a call, not because he pulled out these utensils in an effort to use them inappropriately, but because he sat down for a snack. The teacher pulled out the utensil and contacted us because she said she needed to contact the police because he was carrying a weapon. Mind-blowing to me, and I hope to all of you listening, because a child who was 4 years old, who has never been exposed to such violent behaviors, would not even conceptualize the thought process to begin to think that I'm going to attack someone with my fork, spoon, and knife that I use to eat my food. And yet that was the first reaction that they came to, the first conclusion they thought would be appropriate, because in his backpack, I packed a child's set of utensils. So again, when we talk about adultification, we also have to talk about the demonization of children who are Black. When an educator or an administrator can look at a child, any adult can look at a child, and instinctively they begin to think that that child poses a threat or somehow inherently they're a danger to society. That means we have a larger problem on our hands. The years and years of misinformation and years of perpetuating these racial biases that have existed since slavery, since before then. That's where the problem stems from. And as adults, we have to begin to check ourselves and take responsibility for our part that we play in this process. And really, I'm going to stop there because I just sense that it's a topic that for me, it's very close to home. Never in a million years would I imagine that my 4-year-old son would have to face police while at school or aftercare, simply for having something to eat with.
I'm sorry. I'm going to real quick because I'm getting emotional from what Sophia is saying, and Sophia need, all of the Black parents here need you to understand, it's a 4-year-old child, a baby, a 4-year-old child that an adult individual already demonized, already saw and already put this child on an inappropriate trajectory to prison by the simple fact that he was Black. I know it happens. It happens to our son because when he was inappropriately placed in the LD classroom, the white case manager looked at me, besides telling me that she knew more about my child than I did. She knew what her words were. She knows what is better for my child. And then told me that I was lucky she didn't put him in the autism classroom because she saw the diagnosis of autism. That's it. It's a lot. So I can only imagine what Sophia and his wife went through because I'm emotional. I'm ready to cry about it. It's a 4-year-old child. Who does that? He's 4. 4. I'm sorry.
No, thank you.
And not only is he 4, but if anyone has met my son, as an adult, they would all say that he's loving, gentle, kind. He doesn't even know vicious words to use. I mean, he's such a polite young man that, young boy. I need to be clear with that because obviously words matter and they can be misused. He's not a young man, he's a little boy, okay? And there's no way that if you spent any amount of time with him, that you would make the determination that he's a danger. And so I say that to say, or to dispel all of the assumptions that may be made online by people that don't know him. And I understand.
Right. Sophia, we're going to hear from Thea as well. As most of you, these are raw moments. These are true experiences. These are things that are happening in real time. And Thea, we want to kind of, what are you feeling right now? What is it that you'd like to share?
Well, I'm just very emotional right now because, Sharon mentioned that she wanted to cry. I mean, I'm a crier, okay? And I'm emotional because I have 3 Black sons. And my youngest is 19, just turned 19. And I listened to Sophia's story, and I can remember just throughout their lifetimes, different things happening. And I have felt that they're either going to end up dead or in jail. I don't know I think you can all understand that because of the bias, because someone automatically sees you and thinks, oh, you're going to be a threat. And we see it on TV. We see it happen to people. I personally know people who have been arrested or gone to jail because of their differences. Or one of my classmates, her son was murdered. He was killed. He had a mental health issue. He was schizophrenic. He didn't deserve to die. He needed help. I said in my last, when I said, someone has a problem, are we going to punish them? Are we going to try to get them help? And that's what we're asking for, is help. That's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, all of you. And this is why it's so important for us to speak on these issues and let you know these are everyday occurrences for us, right? We don't get to take a break. We don't get to say color doesn't matter to us, because it very much so does. I can't hide the fact that I am a Black person. Neither can my children. That is the first thing people see and notice. And because of implicit and explicit biases, it is very harmful to our children that we constantly have to deal with these things on top of just trying to get them an equal playing field in the school system just so they can learn like everybody else's child, right? These are the things that we have to constantly deal with. A 4-year-old who is demonized. And this is why words matter as well. In the case of my son, as soon as he was doing things that were not typical of her view of what a 4-year-old does, he began to get the words aggressive, right? Disturbance to the class, when he was just doing typical 4-year-old things. But these are the words that are placed upon our children, and then follow our children, right, for the duration of the time that they're in school.
And Maria, if I can just, and then I really think it's important to say things that follow, things that follow through systems, things that follow when you go to college, things that may follow in a career, things that follow. And again, we're talking about all children, whatever your choice is. All of this leads to a meaningful life in the end. What is your life going to be like as an adult? If behaviors and emotionally disturbed follows you, regardless of where you choose to live, where you choose to work, what your community does, that same words can determine those things for you as well. And those same people may have those same implicit bias towards you. This doesn't stop here. That's why it is so important to start having these conversations, to start listening, and to start talking about how to change that. Back to you, Maria.
And it's so important to understand how these words are so impactful to our children, because again, school to prison pipeline, again, following them throughout the duration of their career. You know, in the instance of my daughter, who has no behavior issues, but she does have anxiety, and that causes a lot for her. And the teacher wrote on her progress report, does not solve problems appropriately, and, you know, does not solve conflicts appropriately. So when I asked her about that and said, you know, we all know she doesn't have any behavior, she's like, oh, you know, that it's an internal conflict she's having with herself. Ma'am, nobody looking at that is going to think that, especially talking about a Black child. So now you've placed this in her record, and then you have the nerve to say, oh, you know, we talked to the teacher that she'll get to next. You don't know if she'll be at the school next year. You don't know if I'm going to take her out and place her somewhere else. So people are going to be reading this file, and again, implicit, explicit biases, read that, see that she is a Black child, and then have placed their own biases of what they think my child is going to be like, just based on this simple sentence that is going to be misunderstood, because it was misunderstood by me, and I'm a therapist. And I was like, ma'am, no, that's not, we're not doing that. So now I'm in a fight to get this off of her record, because I know how much it can be impactful to her educational journey. So if you are a teacher, a staff member, take these things into consideration when thinking about our children, because it very well impacts them and you know, the places that they're able to go, right? So think about these things that you're placing on young children. And I know Saber has something to say as well.
Yeah, so I've been listening, obviously, through everyone's comments and descriptions of things that have happened, and a couple of things struck me. Jess had to step away, but something that she mentioned in terms of culture, and then something that Sophia said about his 4-year-old son in terms of age appropriateness. With my Brandon, who, as I've said, is pretty quiet. He's not your chatty kid. He doesn't really talk a lot. His receptive language is much higher than his expressive language. But in terms of age appropriate things, and this may be, you know, a topic for a whole other presentation, but somewhere around the age of 13, 12, 14, those hormones kick in. And the culture in my family, we're very huggy. You know, people hug, they touch, you know, we're around family members. Hey, you know, come on, give mama some sugar, that sort of thing. And so my Brandon is an only child, and he starts to like girls, and may or may not have an appropriate response to a girl in a class that he likes. And I actually had to work with a person in Philadelphia. She's an expert in the field, Bev France, around the actual definition of masturbation. Because he just touched himself, but he wasn't doing anything and didn't finish and all of that. But it, you know, he liked a girl and he didn't quite understand what was going on. And there had to be some conversations around what was private activity and what was public activity. And I'm not a prude, not by a long shot, but I understand, as each of you, and I think it was Monique and Sharon that have talked about what comes after. So we're not having masturbation put in his records. That's not going to happen, because there are consequences that could then be thought to be some sort of sexual predator. And I might be over exaggerating, but I don't think so, because he's tall, you know, as Sophia talked about, you know, big, burly, you know, so unwieldy that you have to be killed. I'm not trying to set my son up down the line to issues that are natural and age appropriate in terms of behavior. So I just bring that up because there's often an assumption with Black I know with Black boys that they can be sexualized. I know with girls, there's thoughts that they're young. Jess mentioned it in a previous session that, in a situation where, she was thought to be sexually active at 10. And in fact, it was a misdiagnosis when they said she had an STD. So, we need to be very clear about adultifying our children because of behaviors that fit in at age appropriate levels. There's the age when the hormones kick in, and whatever diagnosis you may have or classification you may be in educationally, that make things a little different than when you were 6 as opposed to when you were 16. So that's also an issue, I think, that speaks to behaviors that may be misinterpreted when it comes to what goes in records and what can follow as a result, and what assumptions people make about the behaviors that children have.
That really goes back, if we really want to be honest, again, as we talk about being Black first, that Black strapping young slave, that hard-working Black woman in the fields with carrying all those things on her back and being over-sexualized with master, and the master's wife secretly thinking about that Black slave. Let's just call it what it is. Sophia's laughing.
Laughing in agreement.
But I mean, I just bring it up because often people are uncomfortable talking about sexuality and children and students who may or may not have physical disabilities or learning issues or other exceptionalities. And it's a difficult conversation, with quote unquote typical kids and adults if they're not comfortable with it.
It's a difficult conversation.
Exactly. So I just wanted to under the auspices of behavior and emotional disturbance as a classification
that's misconceived.
Exactly.
All goes back to.
Exactly. And so that those behaviors that are typical and natural with the depending on the age of the child. I mean, because Sophia mentioned it with his 4-year-old young boy. The kid just wanted to eat a snack. How is, he doesn't have any understanding that a butter knife is going to be a problem.
And Saber, it goes to, again, the history, like Monique was saying, but also, looking within the school system, how, and I'm just going to say it, white female teachers view our Black boys, right? So with that view and knowing those implicit and explicit biases, a lot of that is projected onto our children.
Yep.
They could be just doing anything that is typical age, but again, looking at it as, you are a Black male, this is how I'm going to interpret it as, because of the long history, so it has a lot of
there are levels. What the kids say, there's levels to it. It's levels.
Exactly. And we have to, again, call it what it is, like Monique says. So, you really need to be doing the work and checking yourself and checking what you're projecting onto our children, because that's the most important thing when it comes, again, to adultification of our Black children. Right. You're projecting your own issues onto our children. And again, this is following them throughout their history.
In fact, he just had a crush on a girl in the classroom.
Exactly, like any other child will have, right? But again, the Blackness of it all is the issue. The Blackness of it all. So that's what we need to be checking. That's what we need to be checking. And I'll get off my soapbox right now.
And it's 4:25.
So I believe, Sharon, you indicated there were some takeaways that we like to delve into. So Maria, if all is the same, I think we can turn to Sharon.
Yeah.
Yes.
As we wrap up today, and as we wrap up every day, so much of the takeaway we then put upon you. We're all in this together. We're all in it together. But we need to remember that you're the gatekeepers. And with that being said, you need to be the ones to go out and educate yourself, right? There's a wonderful book, several wonderful books, but this is one that you can see where so much of it started. It's called Medical Apartheid. Medical apartheid will show you throughout the centuries what has been done to our Black bodies, and recognizing that this system that has been set up and put in place, we can do, we can say, we can picket, we can riot, we can raise our voices. But unless you are willing to hear what it is we're saying and act upon it, we are by no means asking you to be our savior, because I do not require, need, or want you to be my savior. I am my own savior, myself and my God. But what I'm asking you to do is either stand in solidarity with us as Black parents, or step aside and step out of the way and let us do what we need to do, because what we're doing to benefit our children, in actuality, benefit all children. It benefits all children, and that's what you're missing. You've been living in this world for so long, benefiting from what we have carried on our backs for so long. But if you don't recognize and see, even in society, what is going on, what is happening to the world at large, you're missing a huge point of it. We're all here together as the human race, but you can't be putting upon one race and setting it aside and putting everything on them to carry the burdens of the world while you reap the consequences or the rewards of our labor. And that's what you've been doing. So it will take us all to dismantle the system. But as we're dismantling it, recognize that we're not here to harm you. We're not here to hurt you. We're here to do what is right by our children. And in doing so, all children benefit. And we ask that you recognize that. We ask that you recognize we bring so much to the table, but you've spent so much time living on this white fragility, thinking that you're this super race of beings. I mean, that's not what God is looking at. That's not what God intended. And Mother Nature is not happy with the way things are going. And unless we clean things up, there is going to be a huge reckoning to be had. And it won't be by us, and I'm talking Mother Nature, because maybe she's not happy with what we're doing to the planet. And maybe she will be the one who to decide who she wants to continue to live here and do detrimental things or not to the planet. So I ask you to work with us in solidarity. I ask you to go and read, educate yourself about these implicit and explicit biases that you utilize when you look at our children, and when we're sitting in an IEP room, when there's 20 of you on one side of the table and just 2 of us on the other side. And you're not coming from a level where you're culturally apt, or that you're aware of what goes on in our home and how we raise our children. I'm literally having a discussion with our scouting troop to tell them the way I have to raise my children is totally different than the way you raise your children. And I can't send my child to go knocking on someone's door to say, oh, I'm doing this, collecting something, and I have a service project. My child may not make it home. So we need to be culturally knowledgeable about what's truly going on here. And it is far reaching. And that's what we're asking you to do, is to recognize that it's far reaching what you do on a daily basis to our children. Thank you.
Exactly. We're really wanting you to understand that if you really want to do something, use your white privilege to dismantle these systems that are keeping us held back. If that's what you are wanting, looking to assist us with, help us with that. Don't speak for us, don't share our stories, because it's not your experiences, but use your privilege to dismantle these systems. We want to move from this notion of equity and equality. No, because the systems are still in place that hold us back. We want justice. So that's what we're looking for here. Use your privilege to dismantle these systems that are harming us. You hear our stories, you hear the feelings that we're dealing with on a daily basis. Use your privilege to help us.
And recognize it's a culture. So even though you take down the names from buildings, even though you enact policy, that at the end of the day, we're fighting a culture. There is a culture that's been in place historically in this country, and it has invaded every single facet of the fabric of this country. Every single facet. So unless you recognize and realize and be honest with yourselves about what it is we're fighting, is this cultural biases that you all have and that you all have in place to protect your whiteness. It's not about that. And why is it about a color? I'm a human being just like you. My children bleed. They have the same organs. I have the same organs. Everyone on this panel has the same organs in them as you do. I'm not even going to get on my soapbox on what has been done, what we have been allowed to do, what foods have been geared towards our community, how you set things up in our community where we can walk down the street and get some fried food, but we can't get something that is healthy. Or we can go down the next block or halfway down that block and get a little drinky to drink, because that's something that what someone is also making a dime off of our community. It is far reaching, the things that has been done, and it's not new. So we're here telling you this culture needs to stop. I'm sorry, but thank you.
No, thank you. And I hope that today, I hope more than perhaps previous chats, everyone understands how emotional and how experiential this is. That's one thing that has, that I've learned. Of course, I know what blatant racism looks like when I see it, and I've heard about what microaggressions are, but really understanding that from the time you wake up in the morning, you know, every phone call you make, every interaction you have, that it's just going on all day, every day. I hope that for the school personnel who are listening and watching, and I know you are, I hope that you examine internally, and I know what I'm trying to do is be more intentional in interactions I have with people, you know, personally and professionally, and really examining, you know, if you're doing an OT evaluation, and I'm just saying that because an OT just commented that she wants some action items, you know, it's about looking and examining the behavior and saying, if I take this behavior in isolation, what would my determination be? And what, you know, if this child was white, you know, all other things being the same, what would the end result of this OT evaluation be? And trying to, you know, just like I said, examine and be more intentional in what you're doing. In day to day, and teaching and working, and for parents, if your child comes home and talks about a little scuffle, you know, do you react differently if they tell you the child was white or the child was black? And, you know, taking a moment to pause and saying, is this, you know, if this interaction on the playground was with a white child, would it be kids are going to be kids? But is it because it's a black child, I'm choosing to escalate it? I know that I ask my son all the time, my non-disabled child, because he can talk, and I'm sure he thinks I'm a giant pain in the butt. I'm always asking him about kids being bullied in his class or at school or at lunch, or just because that's, I just do. And, you know, so have those conversations with your kids, like who, and I know they're not in school right now, but, you know, who's getting bullied and why? And can you tell me more about them? And what do you do when that child's being bullied? Because all too often I find that kids who are Black and disabled are getting bullied, and all too often it's the victim who is expected to change their behavior. And I'm working with a young girl right now who has had her placement changed 3 times because of bullying. But meanwhile, the bullies are still where they are. You know, nothing's done to them, but she's had to change her placement 3 times to escape bullying. So have those conversations with your kids and decide what you're going to do about it. You know, are you going to reach out to the teacher and say, hey, you know, my child is reporting that this is going on and I'm concerned.
And Lisa, this is a situation with my young man, who is a young man at 22. And I suspect it may be the same for some families out there, maybe a smaller percentage. But bullying is often described as the aggressor, and the hitting or the words that are mean. The flip side happened to my Brandon. So quiet, I'm not going to describe him as shy, but he was often ignored and not included. So that is a form of, I don't know if you call it bullying, but it certainly wasn't inclusive.
Right.
And so when it came time for, the birthday party, who do you invite? He didn't have any friends. And I'm not a crier, but that broke my heart. Absolutely broke my heart. That my child had no friends, none. And when I look back, and my friends look back on our middle school and high school years, we had squads of kids to go roller skating and partying and whatever the activity was. So there's a flip side of that as well.
Yeah. Also, if your school does have a special ed PTA, some do, some don't. Some states actually require them. I believe Massachusetts does. First consider forming one and getting one going. And second, if there's one, does your special ed PTA, does it reflect your student population? And that's something, all administrators should be asking themselves as far as, when we talked about classifications and disability categories, but your PTA should reflect your population. So, reach out and include Black families and make sure that they're informed and keep them informed of what's going on in the school. And not in a white savior kind of way, but as far as like I said, all your school groups should reflect the student population. I have a parent locally who she wanted to form a group to bring equity to gay and trans students. And she has since expanded it into include all marginalized populations, disabled and minorities. And we're working on examining what curriculum is taught. And, you can contact your school board members and get on, they're always looking for volunteers, and get on the curriculum committee and see what's being taught in history. See what's being taught in the different classes, and have some input on that, because they're approving new curriculum all the time. And these are just, little things here and there that you can get more involved in your school, rather than just witnessing this and saying, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. But for right now, it's just, it's just listening and learning, because I think that even for the people who think you think you know what racism is, and you think that you'd know it when you see it, I think it's just understanding the experience and like I said, how experiential this is all day, every day. For our kids. And it's my friend Pam commented on the video chat when you were talking about adultifying kids, black kids. And, not only is this happening, but it's happening at a school. It's happening at the place that is supposed to protect them and educate them. It's just, Saphir should not have to get on here and convince us that his 4-year-old child is a nice kid. I think we could argue that all 4-year-olds, I don't know of any who are a threat to anyone. There
reminds me of the 5-year-old girl who was arrested and put in handcuffs and taken. I've forgotten what state that was in. I was like, what can a 5-year-old do that you can't grip them up and carry them out of whatever it is they're doing?
Right.
Like, why do you need to handcuff a 5-year-old kid? I think there are also some suggestions, Lisa, for school staff, that when they do see blatant situations, they need to speak up. And sometimes that's not an easy conversation. Sometimes they're talking about colleagues who may have done some things that are not right. And that takes courage. And
you may not win. you may not, and this isn't to toot my own horn, but 8 years ago, I had a situation where a school principal had called one of my clients a psychopath. Now that's not a racial slur, but he called him a psychopath and a few other mental illness slurs. So we did a full FERPA request. And when we did the FERPA request, what do you know? It was chock full of racial slurs too.
Wow.
So, and the school board would not fire him. So he eventually resigned due to public pressure and got his full pension, but the school board would not. And for many months, we thought, what else can we do? We couldn't get him fired. The school board would not remove him, despite blatant racist emails. So
long way to go. We've come a little bit,
right? But you have to. And I was just at the time only speaking up for my client because I thought, well, how is this kid going to get a fair shake? Because if the principal's calling him names, but speak up, speak out, and if you don't get the end result, you still keep going. So anyway, all right. So it is way after 4:30. So thank you to all the panelists today. This will be available on the Facebook page for viewing, and I will send it out along with the book that Sharon mentioned and what other resources may have been tossed around. Okay, I hope to see you next Monday.